welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. My guest this evening is political strategist and political guru, Chris Senecal. Chris?
Thank you. My mom would be so proud with that title. I appreciate
Not a
it.
problem, buddy. How are you? Long time no see. How have you been?
Pleasure to be here. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you here.
Happy holiday.
You as well. So our viewers and our listeners might not know that you and I go way back in working in politics on political races. Yeah. I guess we're going to open the banter this evening of why did you get involved in politics?
And I think this might be similar to your story as well. You know, I actually was kind of born into it to some degree.
Yep.
My family were into politics.
All right.
Whereas most families don't talk about that. A lot of times people would come over to my house and be like, "Is that all you people do in this
right.
house?"
Trust me, too.
They're educators and into politics, so either it was about education or politics, and everybody who wasn't into that really shouldn't come to my house.
Exactly.
Also, if you're quiet, that was also a bad idea to come to my house. So I had, you know, my stepfather was a selectman and then a legislator. My sister married a legislator. My father is a superintendent at school, which I always used to say was a very political job.
Yeah.
So you kind of, it's something you're raised with. Right. You know, I mean, I remember, you know, like in fourth grade, like stuffing, you know, envelopes and holding signs and nailing signs up and doing all that stuff and taking counts from the town hall and running them over to my house. And, you know, so it kind of became ingrained in me. So, you know, a lot of people, when they tell you, you know, well, I'm sorry, I'm not that into politics, I get it, because if it wasn't something you were born into, it's really kind of, I think, a challenge to get into it, which is, I guess, why one of the reasons why, you know, I'm here to talk about, you know, how our younger adults are challenged in this as well.
Right. And I guess we can start the conversation with why, as a young person, you would want to get involved in the political process.
You know, and I think, you know, I am kind of happy to see that, for instance, my daughter, who's in high school, for her senior year, she'll actually be taking a class on government, on local and state and federal government, beyond just kind of the three, you know, bodies in the federal government. And I think that's kind of something, I think it's kind of unfortunate that, you know, maybe the theory is that when you're 18, you know, that's a good time to teach people about government. But I would argue this is something that should be taught in our middle schools.
Right.
Or even earlier, to kind of get a start. And not about the politics of it, but really about, you know, the role that they play. And I think a lot of people just don't understand, you know, and I think, you know, we're in a national political year, and obviously there's a lot of entertaining stuff going on.
Oh, yeah.
It's when everybody actually pays attention to politics, but it's on a very kind of superficial, you know, 30,000 feet level.
Right.
And you know, and the fact of the matter is, you know, while it's very important who we choose as our president and who's in Congress, in a lot of places, in a lot of things in your day-to-day life, it's really far more important who your local, you know, council person is or selectman is or your local legislator is in terms of how they can impact you and your family in your life. But I think that's not something that people learn about or people fully understand. And they don't see the benefit to voting or being engaged in the political process. And quite frankly, young people are no different.
Right.
And in some ways, they feel like they never hear about their issues being addressed.
No.
Which I think is part of the challenge.
Definitely. I was actually talking to a constituent not long ago. Boy, me using big words.
That's right.
Oh, man.
Glad some of those SAT residuals.
Exactly. I was talking to a constituent not long ago, and we were talking about the local elections and just politics in general. And so I said to her, I'm like, are you registered to vote? She looks at me. She says no. And she looks at me again, and she's like, would you like to know why? I'm like, sure, why not? Why? She's like, I'm not registered to vote because I'm afraid if I register to vote, that's how they pick you for jury duty. And she was like, that is not the, she was like, that's why I'm not registered to vote. I'm like, that's pretty harsh, but whatever.
Well, you know, a lot of people have a lot of reasons why they don't vote. And, and I think, you know, life is, I think, more challenging in many ways, and our time is more limited in many ways than it used to be.
Right.
And I think, you know, people work longer hours. If you have families, if you have other things going on, you know, and politics may not kind of bubble up to the surface if you haven't had it banged into your head from a very young age, like some of us had.
Exactly.
And like I said, and I never begrudge people when they're kind of apologetic about, like, I'm sorry. That's not my thing.
No, you're
and I'm
not.
like, that's
Don't worry about
okay.
it.
But at the same time, there is something, the quip that, if you don't vote, you can't complain.
Right.
And there's something to that.
My favorite theory.
And absolutely. And I think that's it is a fair thing to say. But I think what we see is there's been a growing kind of disillusionment of institutions in general. And obviously politicians have been easy pickings, since even before, Watergate.
Right.
So, and we've had plenty of examples of things, since then, whether you talk about, the Reagan years with Iran-Contra, or the Clinton Lewinsky Gate, or whatever you want to do.
Right.
And even, I think, 8 years ago or 7 years ago, people had this probably really unrealistic expectation of the Obama administration in terms of what they could and could not do and what they could and could not accomplish.
Right.
And, and I'd be lying if I said there weren't many things that I was disappointed about too, but I think to some degree those expectations were somewhat unrealistic.
Exactly.
And when you couple that with a Congress that basically decided their whole strategy was, let's not let him do things.
Right.
It doesn't build a lot of trust in government on either side, and
No,
it really
totally
doesn't.
not.
It doesn't, and I think people don't see the point, where they don't feel like people are working to the benefit of everybody.
Totally.
And I think that's something that I think young people really do care about. Really, young people really are engaged in a lot of different ways besides voting.
Right.
Young people tend to be better educated. They tend to be they're more concerned with social justice issues, about fairness, about equality, about income inequality, whether that be, things like gay marriage are not a problem for the younger generation, at a family thing, because these are the kinds of things we discuss in my family, in 50 years there won't be any issues about some of this stuff.
Exactly.
Because all the people who have issues with it, most of them will be dead.
Right.
Right. Because young people just don't look at the world that way.
No.
But they also, they don't see their politicians behaving that way.
No.
So why should I care?
Exactly.
So why should I vote?
Exactly.
So why should I do any of this stuff?
Right. Tell me.
Exactly.
Talk to me. Let's go.
No, but I do think, again, that's why I do get concerned, because presidential elections, and young people are no different than anybody else. This is the year to get people to vote, and if you can't engage people to vote this, in the presidential year, you probably won't get them to vote in off year elections for Congress or in local elections. We know that the drop off is huge.
Yeah.
And even towns that pride themselves on getting people to vote, they brag about getting like 60% of the people out to vote in a local election. That's not that great. If you look at European countries, they cringe.
Exactly.
At that. And I think, it's a challenge we all have. I mean, people have been voting less for the past 50 years. The only kind of demographic that's kind of maintained their voting behavior are people over the age of 65. And that's why politicians often speak to the needs of elderly people.
Exactly.
Far more than they do anybody else, because they know they're going to come rain or shine, sleet or snow.
They're going to show up.
Hellfire, whatever it is.
Right.
Those guys are going to vote. And I remember as a kid growing up when we had local, referendums and things like that. You'd do a head count and they'd ask me, like, well, this is at 10 years old. It's like, were there a lot of people with white hair showing up to them? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
And they knew the school budget was going down hard.
Exactly.
They just knew, because, if you don't have kids in the school system, you don't want to pay taxes.
Exactly.
You're on a fixed income, And again, that's another reason why you need to get younger people involved in the process.
Exactly.
And that's, again, especially when you're talking about local issues.
Right.
We know that a lot of policy gets dictated on the local level, and it's easier to change things.
It is.
On the local level. You talk about school budgets and education policy, or you talk about things like housing and the availability or lack thereof of affordable housing for young families. A lot of that is done by local zoning,
Right.
where it's deliberately done. Now, part of that is to keep property tax values, but we're an aging state.
Right.
And at some point, again, if everybody here is 65 or older, who's going to hold the jobs? Who's going to attract businesses to come here with younger employees that can do the jobs they need to be done? And so it's really at all of our peril if we don't get younger adults engaged in the political process, because we're going to continue to lose them. We already are, because it's so expensive to live here, because there's not enough jobs here. And the more we do to get those folks involved and make them have a stake and give them opportunities to live here and work here, the better off we'll all be in the long run.
Exactly. Now we've got a little bit more time in this segment, so we're going to continue the dialogue as we can. Now, as far as getting people involved in the political process, not only registered to vote, but maybe to get them involved in behind-the-scenes campaign, how important do you think that is?
I think it's tremendously important. Like I said, if you see people, if you get an opportunity to work in a local campaign, it's not just about like working in a local campaign because you really care about the candidate or the issues that they support. It's also an incredibly social thing. And again, I think one of the things we've learned about young people is doing volunteer activities is as much about the social aspect of it as it is the cause. And I don't think that's any different from a lot of other people.
Right.
Because you get to hang out with like-minded people that you might not otherwise get to meet.
Right.
And this, and I think in our world, like young people tend to affiliate through social media.
Right.
But it's sort of impersonal, so you kind of feel alone a lot of the time. So I think the opportunity to work in a political campaign and get to work with a lot of other people who think along the lines that you think is a really positive, motivating factor. And I think that if I didn't enjoy my experiences in campaigns so much, I think I probably wouldn't have necessarily stayed involved. But because I, almost universally had positive experiences working on campaigns, and maybe I'm just lucky because I'm sure there's a lot of dysfunctional campaigns out there you don't want to work on. But I do think there's multiple benefits to doing that, and I do think that if you can show people, that it's more than just whether or not you win or lose or whether or not your issue gets covered, but that it's like really becoming a part of something, which I think people are lacking to some degree now.
Now, are you still involved?
Absolutely. I'm very, it's like, and sometimes it's, when during good times, maybe it's more a matter of writing checks to people.
Right.
Though I don't have as many good times as other people because I'm involved in communications and PR, and it's not as lucrative as it might sound. But that being said, so one of the things, is a lot of it's sweat equity, which is, because I'm in communications and PR, hey, I'll write you a press release. Hey, I'll work on an op-ed with you. And I think, but again, it's only for people who I really, think are going to do a good job.
Exactly.
And I think are going to represent the need, the issues that I care about and for the right reasons.
I was going to say, for our viewers and listeners that don't know, you and I actually met working on a political campaign.
We absolutely did. That's how I've literally half the people I've met in my whole life. It was through a political campaign.
Many moons ago, when I was a lot younger and no gray hair.
As was I. As was I. A lot more hair on top of.
Exactly.
Less gray hair.
Exactly. Now we're going to talk during the second segment about the local and the presidential elections, but we've got a little bit of time before we go into a break. So let's talk about the local elections
this past.
Let's talk about this year. Let's talk about this past.
I think, in speaking purely from a partisan thing, I think, we saw kind of some upsets, some surprising upsets, or maybe, people won, but they won in such a way that I don't think anyone could have seen coming.
All right.
And I do think that reflects kind of general changes in the electorate and kind of having even a greater kind of throw them all out mentality to some degree in some places. In some, it's just really good local politics, and people handle their business and help that not only themselves but the people on their slate.
Excellent. Would you mind sticking around for another segment?
My pleasure.
All right, we'll be right back after a break.
Didn't even know you had breaks.
Don't let E. coli mosh with your food. An estimated 3,000 Americans die from a foodborne illness each year. You can't see these microbes, but they might be there. So always separate raw meat from vegetables. Keep your family safe at foodsafety.gov.
And welcome back to this week's edition of the Pete Mezzetti Show. Sitting here with political strategist Chris Senecal. Chris, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying.
Get enough
sticking
of
around. Yeah, I know. No kidding. No kidding. So we were talking about in the first segment before we went to the break about the outcome of local elections. I was wondering if maybe we can pick up on that a little bit more.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, certainly locally, you had a long time incumbent here in the area in Clinton lose a very, albeit extremely historically close election.
It was, yes,
but
it was.
you definitely get the sense that they didn't see it coming. And I think we've seen that in a lot of places throughout the state.
Yep.
And I think what it speaks to is kind of a general idea of and again, which is sort of getting back to my discussion on bringing in a younger generation of people. It also includes not just voters or campaign volunteers. It actually includes cultivating and recruiting people to run for local office, because I think you do kind of rest on your laurels a bit. And you do have, you have certain generations. There's a lot of gray and white hair or missing hair people serving in a lot of our local offices. And there's something certainly to be said for experience and institutional knowledge. But there's also a real need to bring in new ideas and new people to kind of look at some of the other things that maybe don't get addressed.
Okay.
And I think that having a younger people involved in that process, whether it's, starting on some of the kind of lower level elective, whether there's a library board or things like that to get people's feet wet, and for them to get the experience of seeing how local government works and seeing how you can actually make real contributions, albeit small or large, I think is invaluable to getting, people kind of building up a bench.
Right.
And I think what's happened is for many years, a lot of politicians have been fortunate enough to get reelected multiple times.
Right.
And they tend to kind of, like all of us, we kind of get, it's sort of like marriages. After a while, maybe I don't take her out to dinner as much as I used to.
Exactly.
I think we get that way about our constituency, not intentionally.
No, of course not.
But I think, campaigns in Connecticut usually run, every 2 or 4 years. It's a grind.
It is.
And I think that people just get tired and people get to a point well, everyone knows me.
Yeah,
They don't seem to hate me.
Right.
I'm okay. Right. And, but when you get an opponent who's motivated, who's likable, who gets out there, it can have a real difference.
Exactly.
I mean, you do see younger folks in different places in the state getting more engaged in holding elective office. One case in central Connecticut is in New Britain. Britain traditionally is, dominated by Democratic politicians.
Yes.
The vote count is overwhelmingly Democratic, even more than independents, which is rare in Connecticut.
Yeah, I know.
And you have a Republican governor, a Republican.
A Republican.
That's a Freudian slip. No, he's a Fairfield Democrat. So
yeah.
All right, but no, you have a Republican mayor serving her second term, or running for her second term this past year. And, and she actually experienced the loss of their local baseball team to Hartford. And, she was successful in getting a new baseball team within a month of the announcement.
That's right.
She had some other things just kind of fall into her lap. But she also played, she played the field. She worked with the Democrats. She's a moderate. Yeah. She's not, a major conservative. And I think with local politicians, it's more about we have to balance a budget and we have to get things done. And politicians who do a good job in doing that and also recognize and do the work you need to do to serve the people you serve and answer their phone calls and get back to them when they ask you questions, get reelected. And I think, that's a case where you have a very young, motivated person. She's very likable.
Okay.
She won in a landslide. Yeah. Against a guy that had held office before that, people held in high esteem. But not only did she win, but she took out almost the entire Democratic Party in the city of New Britain.
Did she?
And now we're talking, now she's a serious contender, if she wants to be, to run for Congress against Elizabeth Esty. Now, and she's in her, she's maybe 30. I'm not even sure she's that old. She had a leg up because her dad was the mayor previous to her, but she's nothing like her father, and she's kind of run as her own person, and she's far more popular than her father was.
I didn't know. Her dad was mayor.
Yes, he was. Okay. And but you have other people. Tim Herbst in Trumbull, who
Yep.
barely lost for the treasurer's seats in the statewide campaigns, another younger guy.
Yep.
You know, it's not to say Democrats don't have that.
No, of course
you know, we have certain Chris Murphy.
I was going to
His
say.
first office, you know, he was 25 years old. I actually worked at the legislature right before he came in, and you know, and I remember he was always around, and you know, but he was very focused. He kind of knew what he was getting into, and he was motivated, and he's smart, and he learned the issues. You know, he's always kind of the first one to show up to things, and you know, and it paid off, and you know, and he was able to work that to a House seat, to a state Senate seat, to a congressional seat that nobody thought he would win.
Right.
Simply because that having somebody be that young and that motivated,
Exactly.
it's overwhelming, quite frankly, to a
It
long-term
is.
political candidate, because you know they can knock on doors. They can knock on the doors twice.
Right.
You know, maybe
Right.
you're a little older. You've been in office for a while. You're not going to go knocking on
No, you're
all the
not.
doors
No,
every
no.
time. You know, very few do. I
Exactly.
mean, you have examples of that. You know, even you know Andre Baumgartner, who pulled off another upset out in you know East Lyme area. That you know is a 21-year-old guy.
Okay.
21, not even out of college. In fact, I think when he won election, I don't think he even had his driver's license yet. But what he did is he went
Really?
door to door.
All right.
He's a nice young man.
All right.
You know, worked hard. You know, and people liked him. You know, and he ran against a candidate that maybe didn't do all that. And I think there's power to that. And I think that you know and then you know it comes down to what you do once you're in.
Right.
You know, and I think that you know. It's very easy to get cynical, and I do think that people do have to represent their constituencies first, and then their own political aspirations second. You know, my family, like I said, my stepfather was a legislator.
Yeah.
Now he was very liberal
Okay.
in a district that wasn't, but they always recognized that at the end of the day, he was going to look out for the 3 towns he represented. You know, he may vote for some stuff I don't really like very much,
Right.
but I don't. You know, so what?
Right.
He's my guy.
Exactly.
And there's something to be said for that. You know, and I think that's kind of really also, again, the difference between local and state elected officials and federal, you know, Congress people and presidential candidates is they don't, you know, they get more locked up in ideology.
I was going to say
you know.
presidential candidates. We should
Certainly.
probably talk about them too.
Sure, let's do that now.
Let's
Just
go.
enough about this, you know, good,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
local government, good government
Nah.
nonsense. You know, it's,
Let's,
you know,
right.
no more civics lessons for you people. This is it. Let's get down to it.
Actually,
No.
before we go into the national stuff, I got to tell you, I was involved with a political candidate for a state rep in the local area. Actually, I was involved with a couple of them, but one of them was a gentleman by the name of Brian O'Connor, which I'm sure you remember Brian. And one of the days that Brian took me up to the Capitol with him for the day just to hang out, and Chris Murphy was up there for the day. It's like, so I knew Chris since we were up in Hartford together. I saw Chris at a campaign. I saw Chris a couple summers ago at a campaign event. Him and I were I was campaigning with Jim Crawford, and we were at an event together. And Jim was like, "Chris Murphy, this is my PR guy, Peter Mezzetti." Chris looks at me. I look at Chris. He's like, he walks around the booth, gives me a big hug, and picks me up.
Well,
He's
there you
like,
go.
Jim looks at me. He's like, "You two know each other, I hope." I'm like, "Oh yeah."
No, that's how he gets all his votes.
Oh, yeah, right. That's how
why he's doing so well.
No. So we go. Chris and I go way back. It was nice to see him again.
No, and again, you know, that's a quality that I think, you know,
Oh, yeah.
people don't appreciate enough, is that still getting down to like remembering who you've met before
Exactly.
and worked with before and who supported you. You know, I mean, there's a lot to be said for loyalty.
Exactly.
And people do appreciate, you know, when you remember them.
Exactly.
And so that's why he's really, you know, a really good politician. He's also
great
a
guy.
good senator.
He
So
is.
we're lucky that way.
He is. All right, the year 2016.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Almost there.
Almost there.
Home stretch.
Home stretch. We got a presidential.
Most of us are sick of it already, but
Yeah,
we've been paying too much
yeah.
attention to it. We
Yes,
should be
please.
like everybody else.
Yes,
and
yeah,
ignore
right.
it until it really matters.
Ignore it till like
yeah.
October, but
Exactly.
I don't think that's going to happen
No,
with
no,
you or I.
Nobody's going to have a choice at this point. So.
Presidential election year.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts, feelings, comments. Anything?
I think everybody, you know, a year or so ago, you know, thought this was going to be a really traditional, rather dull campaign. I think we thought, okay, everyone knows Hillary Clinton's going to get it for the Democrats. Jeb Bush is probably going to walk away with it for the Republicans, and it's going to be like, which kind of new monarchy are we creating with the third Bush or second Clinton administration? And and I think we were all like, oh, this is going to be like a snooze fest. And like, yeah, maybe people will vote, but nobody's going to be that pumped up about it. I mean, obviously, like if Clinton wins, it's still historic having a woman president, but just because it felt like it was somebody was going to get anointed, I think everybody was like, okay, well, this is going to be a pretty traditional kind of dull election. And then you had, but then but all these candidates on the Republican side started cropping up.
Everybody started showing
they're
up.
literally, like there are 14 people, and you're like, oh my God, how's this going to work? And none of them really looked like they wanted to go away anytime soon. And and then the Democrats, you had a few guys that just kind of showed up out of the woodwork. I remember, and I'll put it out there right now. I'm in the tank for Bernie Sanders. I know he's still a long shot. But I was, one of the 3% of the people last spring that said they were going to vote for him. And then there's everybody else who either didn't know who the heck he was.
Right.
He's an independent from Vermont, unless you're a real political nut.
Yeah, no, I know.
You don't know who he is.
I know who he is.
But all of a sudden, he started speaking to people, talking about things that they cared about. Right. And then on the other side, you had your Donald Trumps and your Ben Carsons and some of your more traditional conservative candidates and moderate candidates. But I think even to some degree, there's been a recent discussion about how, and Bernie Sanders said this the other day on one of the Sunday talk shows about how he feels that he can actually kind of appeal to some of the Trump voters who are like, middle class and working class people who feel like they've been disenfranchised. I
saw that.
Who feel like, they're not, getting what they deserve, and they're working harder for less. Right. And nobody's listening to them. And he says in his opinion,
that's fine.
Okay, it's probably mine too, but that Trump has done a very good job of finding other people to blame it on. Now, in some instances, it's all the illegal immigrants from Mexico. So you have all these illegal, criminal-like people from Mexico who are keeping you down. Right. And then, you have Muslims coming in and threatening us all with terrorism, and all Muslims are threatening us. And so there's this kind of, demagoguing to take advantage of a lot of anger that's out there. And it's very real anger, and it shouldn't be dismissed, and it shouldn't be kind of whitewashed, because it's real. Because people do feel like they don't have a shot at the American dream. They can't afford to send their kids to college. They can't afford their health insurance. They don't get ahead. They work harder. They make either the same or less. And I think it's made the election a lot more wide open. And in some ways, it's made it also extremely negative and unpleasant for a lot of us. But I think it's also created opportunities to talk about things that haven't gotten talked about before.
Excellent. Well, speaking of talking about things, we got to talk about things at another time, because we're about to say goodnight.
All right.
So on behalf of Chris Senecal, I'm Pete Mezzetti. Thanks and good night, and we'll see you next week.